to choose from within a 10-minute walk of my house. I live in Vancouver's West End, which is predominantly the gay community. It's like Church Street, but not as fun.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the LGBT Center, which has a noon meeting 7 days a week of Alcoholics Anonymous. We have 2 Narcotics Anonymous meetings a week and 1 Crystal Meth Anonymous meeting just at that building alone. And that's not including the neighborhood churches and community houses where these meetings. And now all of a sudden we are told these are shut down and we need to move our meetings to an online platform.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to tell you something. I feel weird when I'm looking at you on a screen doing this, right? Like I would, you know, in a different time, because I have access to flight benefits, I would have said, you know what? I'm going to come into your show. We're going to do it live. I'm going to fly over to Toronto. I'm going to spend the night, you know, and fly back the next day, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very strange to talk to somebody on Zoom and make that connection and
Mm-hmm.
really, because I like to see people dead on. I like to visit with them visually straight up. I don't like to sit on FaceTime or Facebook Messenger. And so to do that with a 12-step meeting, because as I spoke earlier when we had done a previous taping, I said the opposite of addiction is connection.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to develop that connection and make those connections with people who are struggling with the same issues you are when you're not in the same room. Because, you know, part of showing up to a meeting is, you know, you get a handshake or a hug. People are there to support you. I'm
Mm-hmm.
struggling, whatever. Somebody walks up to you after the meeting and says, hey, let's go grab a coffee. Let's talk this out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of a sudden, all of these are not possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they can't even meet you for a coffee off Zoom because there was no coffee shop open at one point. I mean, Vancouver had gone like Toronto, and it was essential service only. So the drugstores, you know, the drugstore was open, but only for so many hours a day. There was reduced hours at the grocery store, and it was, if you were seen on the street, you know, people would be like, why aren't you in your houses? Whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden you have an addict who was new to recovery. They could have been 1 week in before this pandemic started. Their first meeting could have been the day before the shutdown happened. We don't know, right? The blessing that I had through this is that I have long-term sobriety. Like I've been, you know, I've been sober for 19 years now. And so I have those skills and those tools that for the last 5 years, I've been in post-secondary education, plus I work full-time, which doesn't leave me a lot of social time. But if something happened like this when I was in my first year of sobriety or in my first 2 years of sobriety, would I still be sober? I can't answer that. But I do know that I would not have been able to do what I'm doing now back then,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's important in people's first 5 years of recovery that they maintain relationships with people in the rooms, and that they're hanging out with people in recovery and doing things with recovery-based people, and the bars and stuff like that. They'll always be there. When, you know, one day you're going to be able to walk into a bar and not be triggered to drink, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's going to happen 30 days into your recovery. That's what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that both Ontario and BC has talked about, their government has released statistics, is that there has been an increase of overdoses on a weekly basis. So for instance, in Vancouver, there has been an average of over 80 overdoses per week, which means burnout for our EMTs, burnout for our police officers, and burnout for our ER staff. And of course, the increased risk of death. And Ontario has said that they have noticed that there's been a lot of drug-related crime increase in Toronto. So people are struggling to pay for their drugs because they're not working. They're, you know, the ways they normally commit crime are not available to them right now. And so now they're doing new things and they're not smart about it. So they're getting caught right away. So this is happening because we don't have an access of services right now. And they just recently started to open up 12-step meetings in BC, but you can only have X number of people in the room, and you have to have 2 meters apart between the chairs. And so I struggle with that because you don't know if that first person that you're turning away desperately needs to be there. And meanwhile, there's somebody that's got 25 years of clean time sitting in a chair. And I'm not saying it's their fault because they don't have ESP. They don't know what's happening at that door. But you never turn people away at a meeting. And now you have to because the government says you have to. So this is why this is happening, right? And also people getting access to counseling right now has been a challenge because people can't meet with their counselors in person anymore. They've got to do it on a screen, and it's not comfortable. It's not, I don't think that I could sit in a therapy session, and I don't go to therapy. I did years ago, but I don't think that I could do therapy on a Zoom call. It just doesn't seem right.
Okay, so what do you think needs to be done? What do you think needs to happen?
So what needs to be done is people need to start thinking outside of the box. They need to realize that recovery-based services for addiction and alcoholism and sex addiction are necessary services. They're not to be considered additional services or non-essential. A meeting can save a fucking person's life. So to me, that's essential, right? Nobody should have to die of a drug overdose. Nobody should have to feel that there's nothing left for them to do but use drugs. And so the government is starting to recognize how important these services are, and they're starting to open them up, but they're still putting those parameters on them, right? You can only have 50 people in a room. You can only do this, and I get why it's there, because you don't need to have somebody show up with COVID and then infect 50 people with COVID. I get it. So thankfully, because there's a lot of, the weather has been nice in Vancouver, but today's kind of really cold and rainy. People have been holding meetings outside because there's lots of park space. Stanley Park, we have Queen's Park. There's a lot of, it's not like Toronto where like there's not a lot of outdoor space for people to go chill out and have a meeting. Like I think Cawthra Square, you could probably have a couple people, but even now they've done so much gentrifying of that park. Like a lot of the grass area has been used to do the AIDS monument and plant nice trees, and it looks lovely, but it's taken that space away where you could probably get 10 or 12 people to sit and be like, to have a meeting of a 12-step meeting, you only need you and one other alcoholic to do that, right? But okay. It's important, yeah.
But not to cut you off, but where, now a lot of these support workers don't want to work because they know that most of the time marginalized people or people that are seeking desperate help in a sense are probably carrying some form of a STD or some disease or some kind of concerning something in a sense. And where do you think the government's going to get these workers that normally would be, because they feel like they're in a safe environment normally, but for them to know that, like you said, the COVID is out there, where do you think the government's going to get these workers?
So I've actually noticed, and thankfully, most of the hospital staff and support workers have been working, and that is because we have been given additional money to work. So we are getting we are getting at the end of August what is called the COVID top up, which is where you'll have earned a maximum of $3,500 additional pay from the work you've done, depending on the hours, from March 15th until July 15th, and you'll be paid at the end of August. So people at first were hesitant to work, but then when they were like, oh, I'm being paid $6 more an hour, I'm going back to work. So thankfully, places like, Community Connect Toronto and stuff like that, their workers, apparently they've had exceptional attendance records. This is the best, their executive director said. It's amazing what you can do when you're offering extra money. Now, so thankfully, people thought that support workers and jail guards were going to be the biggest concern, but once they sort of financially gave a financial incentive for showing up to work, that sort of changed it. One of my dear friends works at the provincial jail in Burlington, and he said, the problem is not showing up to work. The problem is explaining to the inmates that their visitations are canceled until this is done. Which for me is kind of, you know, I understand the side of why they're not allowed to come. But when you're dealing with a person who's in jail and you like even their first time or whether they're doing life on installment, it is important that they maintain contact with their families, right?
Well, you know, it's for me, I find there's a lot of gaps in between a lot of trying to get people services, trying to make a decision about where we are with the pandemic, which group of people it's affecting the most, who are most likely to succumb to catching the virus, who's more likely to spread the virus. And at the end of the day, there's a big gap between the doctors, the nurses, the support workers, government. And like I said, is that we need some sort of essentials for people that are marginalized in a sense. But when people are in their homes, you would think doctors and nurses or some nurses would be knocking on doors.
Right.
Now, what I found was that if you know where these people are and you know that they're home, and you know that 9 times out of 10, they're safe in their homes. But I think there needs to be some sort of a visitation, a knock on the door to say, are you okay? Because like you said, the virtual thing is not working. And it works for some people, but it doesn't work for, I would say, 90% of the people, because most people, and mainly older people, don't even know how to use a computer.
Right.
So for them to try to do virtual meetings, whether they're, because you know, there's a lot of older people in the shelters, a lot of older people that do drugs, a lot of young people that just don't care that they're in the situation that they're in. And they're not going to just pick up a phone and say, you know, I need help, this and that. They're going to go back to the same routine that they're used to doing, hanging out in the community and looking for a quick fix.
Right.
Now,
and that.
Now, I just want to bring up a couple of things and then you can run it down for me. Like I said, there's a lot of people are going to try to go back to their old ways. And it comes back really quick when you're isolated or there's no services and no help for you. Now we're going to see certain things like the sex addiction. The bathhouses are closed, where a lot of gay men would have probably been socializing and doing drugs in something that they thought was a safe environment. 2, the gay bars, only seating 50 people. Now, these are alcoholics that attend bars on a regular basis or want to go there to see their favorite queen, and they just have an intention to drink just a little bit more than you.
Go see Scarlett for their